Alright, we are back with a new video, and to wrap up my coverage of Survivor 42, I will be doing a player ranking all 18 players based on the games that they played from the season, and for the most part, I would say this was a pretty straightforward list to put together, although there are some deviations along the way, but we'll get to those soon enough. But there are 18 players to rank, and let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the list. So starting off at number 18, the player I believe played the worst game is a bit of a weird case as they technically are not the first boot, but they were the first person voted out, and here we have Zach. And Zach is someone that I very much sympathize with. He is a big super fan of the show, and you can tell that he was trying to play a great game here. The issue is that he never really clicked well with his tribe, where, yes, we did see him build some good relationships, particularly with Romeo early on, but he largely was on the outs from pretty early on, and he didn't really rub certain people the right way to where he is voted out unanimously at the first tribal. And I'm not too sure whether he could have found his footing moving forward, as it seemed like Tori had largely took at that spot for him, and he ultimately lost that battle with Tori, someone that would remain on the bottom of Ika for much of the pre-merge. So that's not particularly great. Now, again, Zach isn't a terrible player, or at least not the worst player in the world. He does know the game pretty well, but at least for the game that he played this season, he wasn't able to build the bonds to really get into a majority alliance. And it's for those reasons I have him here at number 18. Now we're moving on to number 17, and we are now moving on to the first boot, and here we have Jackson. And Jackson's a bit of a question mark for me because I'm not too sure how well he would have done had he stayed in the game, as obviously he was medevac before the immunity challenge, and we never really know for sure whether he would have survived that first tribal. My guess is that he probably would have, as he definitely had Mariah on his side, and Marianne was someone who was seen as a big threat from early on. Now, it's not impossible for him to have been the first boot anyway, but I guess there's that uncertainty at least. But the main reason I have him this low is that even though I don't think he would have been the first boot, I don't think he really had much potential in the game. As yes, he probably would have been loyal to the Taku Alliance moving forward, maybe could have gone to the merge, assuming the rest of the challenges play out as usual. And I do think he probably stays over Mariah if it came down to that. However, the reason I have him this low is, one, the uncertainty of how well he would have done. There's just so much up in the air about it. And also, I don't think he would have been active enough in the game to make the moves that he would have made in order to get himself into a winning position. I feel like he's someone who probably would have stayed loyal to Taku and would have just been a number for them rather than try to make a move on his own. And even if he gets to the end, I don't think he would have had the resume needed to win a jury vote. So it's for those reasons I decided to leave him here at number 17. Now we're moving on to number 16. And again, we are sticking with these early boots. And here we have Mariah. And I feel like Mariah is pretty similar to Jackson in that she was closely aligned to Jackson early on. And there was a debate over her being spared over Marianne at that second tribal, where obviously we saw people like Omar and Jonathan talk about how she is better for them long term than Marianne is. So I feel like that's at least something you can give her credit for. But obviously they ultimately choose to vote out her over Marianne, which isn't ideal, of course. And similar to Jackson, I don't think she would have been a very active player even if she survived past that point, as I feel like she very well could have just been a number for them, someone that could have stayed on the bottom, assuming Marianne got voted out. And I don't think it's a great game at the end of the day, but she did at least get through a couple rounds, and there was at least a debate over her being kept in the game, which is enough to leave her here at number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and I feel like these next two players we'll be talking about are pretty similar in that they were pretty active in the game, but obviously things didn't quite go their way due to various reasons. But at number 15, we do have Swati. And the thing about Swati is I feel like she is someone that knows the game pretty well, and she is very much someone that tried to actively position herself into a strong position. She recognized that Andrea was the leader of Ika and tried to get the numbers there in order to blindside her at the second tribal that they attend. The issue is that she wasn't able to keep Tori on her side, and as a result, Tori ends up leaking the plan, which in turn causes a lot of distrust between the rest of the Ikas and her, and through that, she was able to be voted out there, which isn't ideal at the end of the day. Now, I did talk about in the preseason, and I know a lot of other people mentioned this as well, But obviously, one thing going against her is her age. She was only 19 years old when she was playing the game, which is very, very young. And I feel like she is someone who, if she came back like in a couple of years, she definitely could do better. She probably would have more awareness of what's going on and maybe not try to overplay or sow distrust among the other tribe members here. But at the end of the day, she only survived one round, taking out the second opportunity. And I feel like her lack of life experience really got in the way of her building strong social bonds, especially on an older tribe like Ika. So it's for those reasons that I don't have her too high, and she's here at number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14, and I'm sure some people wish this person was a little bit lower. However, I feel like there's enough merit to their game to have them this high. And here we have Daniel. And Daniel was interesting because I feel like somewhat similar to Swati, he does end up blowing up his game. And arguably, he blows up his game in a worse way than Swati does. Where obviously at that first tribal they attend, it ends up being a tie due to Mike and Chanel not being able to vote. And of course, he and Hai are the two people in the deliberation during the consensus phase of the vote. And he immediately gives up all of his leverage by saying that he doesn't want to go to Rocks. And considering that the Rock draw would have been in Hai's favor anyway, which you do have to credit Daniel somewhat for recognizing that. But the fact that he's just so out in the open about willing to give Hai what he wants here in order to avoid Rocks is pretty terrible. It really shows a level of distrust towards Mike moving forward as well. And he obviously goes further and throws Chanel under the bus by blaming her for voting for Lydia there after he was allowed to vote on the revote. So he literally had two opportunities to try to prove his loyalty to Lydia there. And granted, it probably wouldn't have been great for him to switch, although it would have been better than what ended up happening here. And really, through that one tribal, he ends up burning everything in the game as he loses Jenny, someone who was loyal to him. He burns Mike, someone who he thought was loyal to him, like by completely leaving him out to dry. He burns both Hai and Lydia for voting against them in the initial vote and revote. And he burns his closest ally in Chanel as well by throwing her under the bus. So it was really, really terrible the way he handled that tribal. And I think that really indicates what might have happened to him had that not happened. Now, obviously, you can credit him a little bit because the nature in which this situation came about was largely out of his control. Again, I feel like if it was a straight up vote in which all 6 Vati members got to vote, then Lydia would have been voted out there. And from there, he could have managed things accordingly. But obviously, through Chanel and Mike losing their votes, that results in that situation happening. However, I feel like the way he handles it indicates that if he had handled like adversity moving forward in a future situation, then there probably wouldn't have been much for him to do something similar in the future. So I think that's a really bad indicator of him as a player in general. But the reason I have him this high is because before that first tribal, he was in a pretty solid position where he and Chanel were in the middle of the tribe, where both Hai and Lydia trusted him and both Mike and Jenny trusted him. And yes, while he does get on Mike's nerves, I feel like through him staying loyal to Mike and had that vote gone through as planned, that Mike would have been continuing to be loyal to him moving forward. He just really drops the ball at that first tribal that really blows up his game there. So again, it's not a great game at the end of the day, and I don't think Daniel's that great of a player as indicated by his handling of everything after that first tribal, but it's just the fact that he did have that good position, at least at the beginning. That's enough to put him here at number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13, and we're actually on the highest ranked pre-merger at this point, and here we have Jenny. And I know Jenny wasn't the flashiest player in the world, but I feel like she got really unlucky at that first tribal that we just talked about with Daniel, where obviously she came into that tribal with the numbers. Like, she had Mike as her closest ally, she had Daniel willing to vote with her, and she also had Chanel on her side as well. But both of her allies, Mike and Chanel, lose their votes there, which results in the deadlock vote. And obviously the way Daniel handles that situation is pretty terrible. Although really by that point she was kind of screwed, because had it gone to a rock draw, then it would have been it would have been Mike and Daniel drawing rocks, while on the other side only Hai would be drawing rocks. So it really wasn't built in her favor anyway. So it wasn't ideal there. But still, like the fact that she was in a good enough position to where she would have survived that first vote, had all these twists not come into play, is a good indicator of her moving forward. Now, obviously, you do falter a little bit for being the target to begin with, but I mean, at the end of the day, she shouldn't have been in as much trouble as she would have been to begin with. So I feel like Jenny is someone who definitely would have had more potential had she stayed in the game. It's just through really unlucky circumstances that causes her to be voted out. And that's the reason I have her as the highest ranked pre-merger. So she's here at number 13. And with that, we are now moving on to number 12. And in case you haven't noticed, every player remaining on this list has made the merge. Yes, I said merge. But at number 12, we actually have the merge boot here. And here we have Lydia. And the main reason that I have Lydia this low is the first tribal she attended. This is literally the third person I'm talking about in a row in which that tribal factored into their game. But the biggest knock here is that she should have gone home there. Like the majority of the tribe was planning to vote against her coming into that tribal. But it's through the weird circumstances of Mike and Chanel losing their votes there that result in her having a tie. And obviously through the deadlock and the way the rock draw could have worked out, she definitely was benefited by all those votes being lost and through Daniel completely dropping the ball here. So she really gets lucky here by being saved by that situation. But from that point on, like she is sort of in a power position with Hai to where if they had gone to another tribal, then she would have had the numbers there. And sure enough, that's what happens when they vote out Daniel there. So obviously that's pretty ideal. But then we get to the merge where obviously her and Hai ultimately get absorbed into the majority alliance that forms there. And granted, I mean, that alliance probably wouldn't have stuck together too long into the post-merge, but she was technically in the majority at one point. But then the hourglass twist comes into play to where obviously through easy targets like Chanel and Tori getting immunity, she just became the next easiest target there. And obviously the majority turns on her. And even her closest ally, Hai, votes against her in order to stay in the majority. So obviously those aren't great. And she does get technically unlucky there. But then again, she also gets very lucky at the first travel she attended. So I feel like at the end of the day, those equal out. And aside from that, I don't find her game too impressive. But there are pros there, like her being in a swing vote after the first tribal with Hai, to where she belongs here at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and we have the next boot on the board. And here we have Chanel. And Chanel played a pretty messy game for the most part. She obviously starts off in a pretty good position on the Vati tribe where her and Daniel are sort of in the middle of things. Granted, the way that she talked about in confessional made it seem like it was more so out of convenience than to any bond that she genuinely built with Daniel, but she is technically in that swing vote position. And then obviously coming into that first tribal, her and Daniel were technically the swing votes there, as the Hai and Lydia side, as well as the Mike and Jenny side were going after each other. But then she ends up going to Shipwheel Island or the Summit. And there, I feel like she makes the wrong decision there in risking her vote. Now, the thing about this is that she obviously tells Omar while at the island that she needs her vote coming into this tribal. She's the one going to tribal, Omar is not. And she should have recognized there that with these circumstances that Omar would have chosen to risk his vote, as obviously he would assume that she would protect her vote, knowing that she would need it coming into the tribal, and then through that, he would get the extra vote there. But then obviously, Omar makes the optimal decision there and risks a vote there. But then obviously, she decides to risk her vote as well for seemingly no benefit, as again, she should have recognized that Omar's optimal move there was to risk his vote. But then obviously, her vote was obviously very important as well, regardless of any benefit she could have gotten from risking her vote and then getting the extra vote on the off chance that Omar decides to protect his vote. So obviously through this miscommunication, which I do give more fault to her than to Omar, she ends up losing her vote coming into this tribal. And she does try to pass it off like she still has her vote by trying to formulate this weird split vote plan, like this weird 2-1-1 vote, which obviously sketches some people out. And then obviously she, along with Mike, don't have their votes there. and that creates the tie situation. Like they tie, they get deadlocked, and then in the consensus phase, we see Daniel completely throw her under the bus there, which again, more eyes are on Daniel in this situation, but it also reveals to the rest of the tribe that Chanel risked her vote, and she took the risky option in losing it there. And then while she does come out not as bad as what Daniel is, like she's still not in a great position moving forward. She is technically in the minority at this point, and we see at the next tribal that like Hai and Lydia are considering voting her out, as Daniel really doesn't have any options moving forward. And you can argue that it would have been in Hai and Lydia's best interest to vote out Chanel at that second tribal, as through that, Daniel would have remained loyal to them, while Chanel came off as someone who was a bit more active in the game and arguably had more outs in the game moving forward. But obviously, she does get spared there. But then coming to the merge, she was in a very bad position where her and Tori are seen as easy boots there, and she probably could have been the merge boot had it not been for the hourglass twist, which through that, she is granted immunity there. And then through that, they obviously vote out Lydia. But then at the next tribal, again, she's the easy boot. She needs to win immunity. When Tori wins immunity, she ends up being toast there. So at the end of the day, it's not a great game. Now, similar to Swati, I don't think Chanel's the worst player in the world. She seems to have a good strategic mind moving forward. And I haven't even mentioned how at the second tribal, she cast her vote for Mike, which would have countered any shot in the dark that Daniel could have played, which obviously showed some distrust in Mike moving forward. But I don't think it's the worst move in the world, as again, had Daniel used a shot in the dark and had it worked, then it would have created a tie between her and Mike. And yes, while she probably would have gone home on the revote, like it shows that she was willing to look out for herself and willing to do the optimal thing that would protect her. Now, and again, while the rest of the players didn't see it that way, it still shows that she has some potential moving forward as a player in a future season. So I feel like there's enough merit there to have her this high. Plus, she does survive a couple tribals there, but I feel like she makes enough big mistakes there, like her decision at the summit and then her bad position moving forward, that leaves her here at number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10, and we have someone pretty similar to Chanel, although they did have a bit more longevity, and here we have Tori. And I feel like Tori is someone who was technically in a worse position for a lot of the pre-merge compared to Chanel, where obviously Tori was instantly seen as on the out. No one particularly trusted her too well, and she's never really able to build strong bonds there. She has some rivalry with Roxroy and later on with Jonathan, which isn't great. And she is an option to be voted out at each of the tribals that she attends in the pre-merge, where obviously at the first tribal, it's between her and Zach, basically. And then at the second tribal, it's between her and Swati. However, she is able to maneuver herself all right there, despite her not having many social bonds there, where I think people recognize that she was a very self-interested player, which through that allowed her to get through the Swati vote all right, even though people recognized that she was someone who was going to flip at the merge, and she made it very clear that she was going to flip on the merge. But obviously that's also something that made her a target coming into the merge, where she isn't really able to improve her position that much. And like Chanel, she is seen as an easy target during those early rounds where she is let down the majority group. And then from that point on, she basically has to win immunities. And she is able to win 2 immunities in a row, giving her safety there in a position where she could have been voted out there. But then obviously, at the split tribal, she is unable to win immunity there. But to her credit, like there was a point during that round where like she was poised to be saved there, as it seemed like more of the focus was on a potential Drea blindside, and she was fully willing to go along with that Drea blindside. But then obviously we saw what happened, where through her tribe winning the challenge and getting to go to treble second, we obviously see they get to see Roxroy on the jury there, which prompts Drea and Marianne to completely drop their plans and play their idols. And then through that, it basically becomes a simple Tori vote there. And at that point, she does play her shot in the dark and is unsuccessful and is voted out there. So at the end of the day, she does get pretty unlucky because her tribe did go to the split tribal second. So they got to see Roxroy being voted out, which in turn prompted a lot of those plans to shift. However, she was also on the bottom for a lot of it and had to win immunity coming into the merge. So that's not particularly great. However, I feel like she had more outs moving forward than Chanel, to where I feel like Chanel was pretty dead in the water by the time of the merge. Whereas Tori, yes, she was in a bad spot. I feel like had she gotten through that split tribal, she probably would have been in an alright position. So I feel like that's something I can give over Chanel there, and a big reason that she's here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and I don't think this player played a great game per se. However, they did last quite a bit, and here we have Roxroy. And the thing about Roxroy is, yes, he wasn't that great of a player. He seems very reminiscent of an old school player, someone that doesn't care too much about strategy and really cares about like camp life and what have you. And obviously that was a big detriment to his game. But to his credit, he is able to make it decently far despite that, where obviously he is in the majority at the first tribal. He is able to get into that majority alliance with Andrea and Romeo right out the bat, which is pretty good. So, and they vote out Zach as a result. Then we get to the second tribal that they attend, where it doesn't go as well for him, where he obviously loses Swati, who was his closest ally, and he was let out of that plan entirely, which isn't ideal, as Swati was someone who was close to him. And then through that, it gives more of the power to the Drea and Romeo side of things moving forward, while leaving Tori in the game, someone who actively despised him for a lot of it. So that isn't ideal. And then coming to the merge, where he is technically in the majority alliance. However, he is left out of a lot of the core plans. He isn't really a core decision maker there. He obviously gets the hourglass twist, where he obviously gets sent to exile. And then through that, he is given the choice to reverse time or whatever. He obviously takes it because why wouldn't anyone take it? And then moving forward, he's just kind of there. I mean, he isn't that big of a driver of the game moving forward, and he does vote in the majority for the most part. However, we then get to the split tribal, where we see him trying to get all the alpha males together to run the game. And while he does have people like Mike and Jonathan on his side initially, we obviously get the split tribal situation, which isn't that great for him, as he is stuck on a tribe with Omar, and Romeo, who, despite being men, have no interest in like being a part of this male group. And obviously he is an easy target at that split tribal, despite him not really realizing it, to where even Mike votes against him, someone who gave him his word. And obviously that's not ideal. And obviously his vote out at that first tribal is what ultimately affects the second split tribal there. But obviously he isn't that big of a factor in there directly. So that is something, at least for him. In general, I feel like Rockstar is a pretty passive player for most of the game. I don't think he really wins a jury vote in most scenarios, and he definitely rubs some people the wrong way, people like Tori, although he was able to build some bonds out there, particularly with people like Mike and Jonathan. So there are enough merits there to have him relatively high on the list. However, I'm not too impressed by him overall, and he's here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and we have the person that came in 8th place, and here we have Hai. And Hai is another weird player to talk about because he is definitely a big player, someone who is definitely a lot more active than someone like a Roxroy, for example, and even arguably some of the people we'll be talking about soon. However, I don't feel like he had that much control, especially in the post-merge. Now, obviously, in the pre-merge, he and Lydia are a duo early on with Daniel and Chanel in the middle. And it seemed like coming into that first tribal that he was going to get blindsided there and obviously lose Lydia, his closest ally, at that vote. However, he does get benefited by all these advantages coming into play, like Mike's Beware advantage and Chanel risking her vote for some reason during her trip to Shipwheel Island. That results in both of them losing their votes and allowing him to have a tie. And it would have been one thing if he recognized this and really tried to force Daniel's hand here. However, it's pretty clear if you see his reaction at Tribal that he didn't know what was happening, as he literally asks at Tribal, where are all the votes? You know, and obviously that's not great there. And while he does come out on top during the deliberation, I mean, he did have a number of advantages there. I mean, where obviously first, he would have had the numbers on a rock draw, where he would have been the only one drawing rocks, while on the other side, it would have been both Mike and Daniel drawing rocks there. So there's that. And the other thing is that Daniel screws it up worse than Hai, to where Daniel literally says at the beginning of the deliberation that he doesn't want to go to Rocks, which basically gives all the leverage to High here. And yes, while this all benefits High, and you can give High credit for being able to maneuver this situation, I don't think you can give him too much credit, as again, he did have these advantages that he didn't have to work super hard to get. So it was more so him not screwing up than him actively manipulating, say, Daniel to blow up his game, for example. But he does get his way there. Jenny goes home. And obviously, for the rest of the pre-merge, he and Lydia are in a swing position, which is pretty ideal for them. Although I do think they make a questionable decision in voting out Daniel at the last tribal before the merge, as obviously Daniel has proven himself to be untrustworthy, and I guess I can understand that. However, Chanel has also demonstrated herself as having more options moving forward, and obviously you can debate over whether voting on Chanel would have been the better option there. But they do have the control there, and they're able to vote out Daniel on the revote. Coming to the merge, he is in the majority group along with Lydia. However, it's pretty clear that the Takus have more influence on that tribe than he does. And obviously, we see him talking about how wanting to have agency in the confessional. But then at the first tribal, he not only loses Lydia, his closest ally, he votes to vote out Lydia as well. And obviously, you can argue that he did this to stay in the majority there, but it's also come out in post-show interviews that something High cared a lot about was playing this quote-unquote perfect game where he always wanted to vote in the majority. And so he voted out his closest ally, not because it would have benefited his game, but because he wanted to have a perfect voting record, which I kind of get, but it's also pretty dumb and arbitrary at the end of the day. So there's that. Plus, it weakens his position moving forward. He's obviously able to stay in the majority in the next few rounds, voting on Chanel and Roxroy. However, he does start to lose control, particularly with Mike. Mike was someone that he was able to have on his side early in the merge, only for Omar to successfully pull Mike away from High, and obviously High is pretty much a goner at that point. So obviously that's not ideal there. And I think it really highlights how, despite him being in the majority alliance, he wasn't really in the driver's seat there, and he didn't really do himself many favors by voting out his closest ally and then weakening his position moving forward. So I feel like on the whole, High is a bit of a mixed bag. Again, he is someone that thinks strategically a lot and is someone who definitely tried to play in his best interest at points. However, I think he made a number of questionable decisions, some of which is due to him not having the proper read on the game. Some of it is due to his obsession with having a perfect game. And something I didn't even mention earlier is that his ideal final three would have been Omar and Andrea, which I don't think is that great for him, as I feel like he would have struggled to win that jury vote. So I feel like even beyond that, his end game plan wasn't really something that would have led to a win there. So on the whole, High is a bit of a mixed bag, but he did have some merits to his game, particularly with that first tribal, which is good enough to leave him here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and I had a bit of a debate with myself over this next entry, as this person obviously made it very deep into the game, and I do have to give him some credit for that. However, despite them having an alright pre-merge, I feel like this person had a very, very terrible post-merge. But at number 7, we actually have one of the finalists from the season, and here we have Romeo. And Romeo's a really weird game to assess because, on one hand, he had a pretty alright pre-merge where he was in the majority alliance early on with Drea and Roxroy. And while he doesn't get his way at the Zach vote, he is able to stay in the majority there. Obviously, at the Swati vote, he's also in the majority for that. And in general, it seemed like he had a good relationship with Drea and even Roxroy to a degree in that pre-merge. So his pre-merge game is pretty alright, actually. But then we get to the post-merge, which he is actively left out of the majority alliance, despite people like Drea and Roxroy being a part of that group. You think that he would have been included there, but then it came out afterwards that a big reason why he was left out was because of his paranoia. He started to let his paranoia get to him, which in turn caused him to be in a bad position. And it's literally to the point where, yes, he isn't really being targeted for a lot of those rounds, particularly later on in the post-merge, although he is still a target during some of those post-merge rounds. And in turn, it leads to him being left out of plenty of votes. It's actually kind of laughable how many votes he does incorrectly post-merge. He votes for Marianne during the Lydia round. he votes for high during the Chanel round. He does vote correctly during the Roxroy round, but then after that, he votes for Jonathan during the high round, and he votes for Mike during the Drea round. And yes, he does vote correctly in the Omar round, and he does vote correctly in the Lindsay round, but literally, like, over half of the post-merge is him voting incorrectly, even though, like, some of these votes were put together to save him. The Chanel vote is a great example of this, where he was the secondary target for that round, and even got 3 votes against him, but for whatever reason, he wasn't even looped into the actual Chanel plan that was designed to save him, and he votes for High. Now, granted, he did say afterwards that this was a hinky vote to make High more paranoid, but it isn't super effective at the end of the day. He also makes a fake idol during the post-merge, which he does try to give himself some safety, but it's pretty evident that no one actually took this seriously, and it was more so him getting pulled through the game because at that point he was essentially a GOAT. And while he does win Viral Immunity and he does take Marianne to the end, he really had no shot at that point, as Marianne for sure beats him. I feel like Mike also beats him straight up, and even Jonathan, who wasn't that well liked by a lot of the jury, I feel like even Jonathan would have a serious shot against him. I feel like his only actual shot of winning is a final 2 against him and Jonathan, but even then that was never happening, so there's that to consider. And on the whole, it's a very, very bad post-merge. And by the end of it, he really had no shot of winning the game. So that was something that really weighed on me over how low I should put Romeo on the list. Because yes, while he does get to the end of the game, and yes, while he isn't being targeted for most of the post-merge, like, he is in a very bad position there, and he's rarely voting in the majority. However, the pre-merge is good enough, I guess. And yes, he is technically able to find some footing, particularly around the Omar vote. So there's that at least, but it's still not a great game at the end of the day. And because of that, 7 is about as high as you can put him. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we actually have the highest ranked Ika member left on the board. And here we have Drea. And for me, it was a debate between Drea and Romeo, as yes, while Romeo did make it significantly further in the game than Drea did, I still feel like Drea had more control in the game and probably had a much better shot of winning the game if she had gotten to the end. She's obviously in a pretty central position on the pre-merge tribe, where she's basically the center of the tribe there, which involves her, Romeo, and Roxroy there. They're able to have the numbers at the Zach vote, despite that being against Romeo's best interest there. At the Swati vote, yes, Swati was planning to blindside Drea, like get Tori on board in order to do so, but they ultimately leaked the plan to her, and they are able to turn the votes against Swati there. So that is something in Drea's corner at least. And then we get to the post-merge, in which she is included in the majority alliance, and while the Takus are the center of that group, Drea is still in a pretty solid position moving forward, in which she is able to drive a lot of those votes there, particularly the Lydia vote, the Chanel vote. But then obviously we get to the split tribal round, in which it isn't an ideal round for her, where obviously we see people like Jonathan attempting to flip the vote against her by the split vote plan. And obviously Drea has multiple advantages throughout the game. And obviously she was seen as a threat due to her having all these advantages, such as an extra vote at that point. She had her idol from the Beware advantage, and she later gets the Knowledge is Power, although at that point people didn't really know about that. So she had all these advantages, which in turn made her a big threat. And obviously, had it been a straight up vote, I mean, it's unclear exactly who would have gone home there. But obviously, she gets kind of benefited by the fact that they go to Tribal second, and they get to see Roxroy sitting on the jury next to Chanel, which in turn gets a big reaction out of Drea and Marianne. And obviously, in turn, that causes both her and Marianne to drop their plans, to go after each other. They both play their idols there and show some solidarity in that situation. Now, I won't really credit that too much as a game move, as it's pretty clear that it was a largely personal move for both her and Marianne, but it does allow her to get through that round nonetheless. And then from that point on, she is still in the majority there. However, obviously we get to the final 7, where again she is being seen as a big threat. She obviously tells Omar about the Knowledge is Power that she got, and that ultimately proves to be the death knell for her, in which Omar is able to go to Mike tell him about the knowledge's power and allows him to counter it. And once Lindsay is able to survive the do or die, she's essentially the main target there and doesn't really have much in the way of saving herself, especially once the knowledge's power is unsuccessful. And through that, she is taken out, despite that not really being in the best interest of people like Omar, for example, who very much could have used people like Drea as a meat shield moving forward. So, on the whole, I feel like Drea played a mostly solid game. Obviously, had a decent amount of control in the pre-merge, and while she wasn't the main driver through a lot of the post-merge, she was still in the majority for the most part. So that is something I give her credit for. But obviously, like, she would have had a very difficult path to the end, even with all of her advantages. So I feel like that is a big knock against her. But to her credit, like, she still had people like High that were willing to take her to the end. And obviously, it's not great that she voted High out, but it did show that she had plenty of relationships in the game that could have carried her forward. So obviously, it's for all those reasons that I decided to have Drea this high in GCR number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and this is another interesting player to talk about. We actually have the final juror of the season, and here we have Jonathan. And Jonathan played a pretty interesting game, all things considered, where obviously a lot of his pre-merge was defined by his physical strength, literally single-handedly carrying his tribe to victory in a lot of challenges. And obviously you could knock him a bit for threat management, as he was seen as this big physical threat from very early on. However, I feel like Jonathan deserves some credit as he recognized that he is this big physical guy, and we see him like trying to play into that, saying that he should be kept around as a shield and someone that can serve the tribe in winning all these challenges. And he is pretty effective in doing so for a lot of that pre-merge there. That's something you can give him credit for. And plus, he was a member of that Taku 4 Alliance. Now, granted, he didn't have the best relationships with a lot of those people, as Lindsay has come out postseason saying that she actively despised him. And even Marianne, like, was someone that he got into a bit of a rivalry with for a lot of the game. So obviously there's that to consider. And then obviously in the post-merge, like, he is included in this majority alliance. And while people like Lindsay are despising him, like, he is still included in a lot of those decisions there. He is in the majority for the Lydia vote, the Chanel vote. And then obviously we get to the split tribal, in which he does have immunity there. However, he does try to drive the vote, and he makes a number of mistakes there, where he tries to split the vote between Drea and Marianne, which isn't the worst move in the world. I mean, to try to target Drea, but I think trying to split the vote on Marianne was a bit of a mistake, especially when that split tribe had a very easy like backup target in Tori there. And he obviously tells Marianne that she is the backup target, which gives her very little reason to trust him moving forward. So that isn't great. And then obviously, while they do eventually get Tori out, he definitely doesn't come off the best during the discussions there, where it seemed like he was still trying to get the Drea vote going forward, only for that to completely backfire. And we see people like Lindsay talking about how he doesn't understand the game very well, so that's not particularly great. And then moving forward, like, he is still seen as this big threat, although he is able to remain the majority for the most part, voting in the high vote, the Drea vote, and he is included on the split vote plan during the Omar round. And in fact, he's actually the first person to mention the possibility of blindsiding Omar at 6, so that is something you can give him some credit for. But then obviously we get to the end game, in which it's basically between him and Lindsay. Obviously, he's able to outlast Lindsay there. And at the final 4, he does lose the fire making challenge against Mike. So I don't think it's the worst game in the world, although he does make a number of blunders along the way. And despite him being this big physical guy that people talked about targeting multiple times, he did have enough allies there that were willing to keep him around, largely as a shield moving forward. However, I feel like the biggest knock to his game is, one, again, I don't think his strategic ability is necessarily the best, as demonstrated during the split tribal. And then second, I feel like he would have struggled to win a jury vote, as we heard people like Lindsay and Tori talk about how they don't really want to reward someone like him with a win, largely to his gameplay there. So that isn't ideal, as I don't think he really wins jury vote in most scenarios. So there are plenty of knocks to his game. However, there's enough merit there, like him being the majority and him not being targeted more, despite him being this big physical guy, is enough to leave him here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have a pretty interesting player to talk about as well. And here we have Lindsay. And Lindsay is interesting because I never really felt like she had much of a shot of winning based on her edit. However, for looking at the game that she played, I feel like it was mostly pretty impressive. Where early on, she is in the majority group, particularly connecting with people like Omar and Marianne to a degree. She is in the majority there to vote out Mariah and is able to stay in the majority moving forward, despite her not really liking Jonathan too much. Coming to the post-merge, she's put in a great position in which her and Omar are basically able to run the majority alliance moving forward. And I consider Lindsay as someone that worked alongside Omar for a lot of the game. She seemed to be the second most likely person to be in control of the game at any given time. And I have to give her a lot of credit for that. She is able to be in the majority for all these votes, particularly the Lydia vote, the Chanel vote. Then we get to the split tribal, in which she technically would have been in danger there, as obviously with Andrea and Marianne playing their idols, and with Jonathan being immune, that meant the vote was basically between her and Tori. And while it was pretty obvious that Tori was the more likely person to go home there, she technically would have gone out had Tori shot in the dark hit, so there's that to consider. She is in the majority again for the high vote as well. And then we get to do or die, in which she obviously chooses to compete in the challenge against Jonathan. And obviously, you can question whether that was the correct decision, especially since she's the only other person to compete in that challenge. And she obviously loses, causing her to go into do or die. And while she is able to survive it, I mean, she didn't have the best odds there, especially with her not picking the swapped option. Of course, the Monty Hall problem, in which her odds would have been better had she swapped the option. And just so, while she doesn't do that, and she technically didn't do what was more probable to happen, it still ended up working out for her. So you do give her some credit for that. And then obviously after that, Andrea is able to be voted out there. And then after that, like, she essentially like loses control of the game, where Omar is blindsided at 6. And at 5, she essentially has to win out. And when she's unable to do so, she is voted out there. So again, she is in control for most of the game. And while she does lose it at the very end, I do think that she probably wins a jury vote she gets at the end. I feel like she was definitely one of the more respected players out there. And I feel like if she was at the end against anyone other than Omar, then she would have had a very solid chance of winning the game. However, you can fault her for a few things, particularly voting out High and Andrea, as those would have been big shields for both her and Omar, although I do fault Omar more so for that. So that's something at least. However, I feel like on the whole, she did play a pretty solid game, and it's enough to land her here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and for me, this is the definitive top 3 for me. It's just a matter of the order. But at number 3, we have the lowest placed person left to talk about, and here we have Omar. And I feel like Omar played a pretty solid game on the season, in which he was a pretty big power player for the most part. Early on, he's essentially in the center of the Taku tribe, in which he has people like Lindsay and Jonathan. Even Marianne is someone who was in his corner to a degree. He's able to control that early vote. And yes, you can give or take with his decision to vote out Mariah over Marianne. However, he is able to remain in a solid position moving forward, and especially able to keep Marianne on his side for a lot of that post-merge. Coming into the merge, he does not have his vote, largely due to Chanel's decision to risk her vote. And obviously that's not ideal for Omar. However, as I explained earlier, I feel like Omar was pretty well justified in risking his vote while on Chippewa Island, as he knew that Chanel was going to tribal and reasonably assumed that Chanel should have chosen to protect her vote there, which gave him permission to risk his own vote, which obviously backfires. Again, you do fault him a little bit for not having the correct read on Chanel, but again, I don't fault him too much for it. I mean, to the merge, he's able to build the majority alliance, particularly with him in the center of it, along with the rest of the Takus. And despite him not having a vote, he is a key factor in keeping the Takus together and rallying the numbers against Lydia, which in turn gives the Takus a lot of power in the majority group, really weakening the high groups moving forward. And then, he is able to stay in the majority moving forward. Again, he votes out Roxroy at the split vote. But then after the split vote, starting with the final 8, I feel like he does start to make some questionable decisions, where at 8, he does vote out High, and at 7, he votes out Andrea. And to me, I feel like these were mistakes, as High and Andrea would have been pretty big shields for him moving forward. And plus, they were relatively loyal to him, as High has said in post game interviews that he would have taken Omar to the end. And I feel like that would have put Omar in a pretty solid spot to win the game. So I feel like voting out High was an ideal there, both from a positioning standpoint and from a win equity standpoint as well. And then obviously at 6, he is sort of the biggest player left on the board, which prompts people like Marianne and Jonathan to flip the game against him, which isn't ideal. And I feel like even worse is the fact that Lindsay doesn't play his idol on her idol on him. Now I do fault Lindsay more for that than anything else, as they literally had no reason to not play the idol, but like it is what it is. And he's voted out there. And the main reason I have Omar this high is because he was the biggest player this season, and I felt like he would have had a solid shot of winning. Now, we haven't gotten confirmation over whether he would have beaten Marianne or not. However, I feel like against Lindsay, Jonathan, Mike, a lot of those people in the end game, he easily wins against. So I feel like those are enough credits for him. And he really was the biggest player of the season for a lot of it, having a lot of control on how the game played out. However, he didn't have always the best decisions within that power position, which does lead him to be voted at 6. And I can't have him too much higher, as he is only in 6th place, but he has still played a pretty solid game, and he's here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and in case you haven't noticed, the top 2 players are all people that made it to Final Tribal, and it's just a matter of the order. However, at number 2, I did decide to have the runner-up of the season, and here we have Mike. And Mike is a weird player to talk about because, on one hand, I feel like he had more control throughout a lot of the game than the number 1 player we'll be talking about. However, he definitely did not exercise that control to the best of his ability. And I feel like there were points where he did play pretty emotionally too, where he did ultimately have some bad jury management and ultimately dropped the ball at the end. Now, early on, of course, he is aligned with Jenny, and it seemed like coming in that Daniel and Chanel were also on his side there, where he obviously does find the beware advantage, and we see Daniel consider voting him out, which isn't great. However, he ultimately is able to turn it into his favor, to where Daniel and Chanel should have been on his side coming into that vote. But then when Chanel also risks her vote and loses it, that causes a 2-2 tie, and obviously from there, Jenny does go home there, which isn't ideal, as Jenny was his closest ally. However, he is able to turn around relatively quickly by building an alliance with High there, and he's able to get back into the majority pretty quickly, voting out Daniel at the next tribal there. However, we also see Chanel voting for him in the event that Daniel had used a shot in the dark, to where, yes, it would have been a bad position for him, as he would have been involved in the revote. However, the numbers were there for Chanel to go home on that revote anyway. But we also see Mike take this very personally, and from that point on, like, he's basically having this vendetta against Chanel, and he's basically sucked into tunnel vision to vote out Chanel, not because it's good for his game, but because he feel like she slighted him. So there's that to consider. Coming into the merge, like, he is part of the majority there. He does get immunity through the hourglass twist, and he does vote out Lydia, which is a bit of a questionable move, but the numbers just simply weren't there to keep Lydia anyway. After that, he does vote out Chanel, and he does get a lot of credit on the show for driving this vote. However, it's also pretty clear that this was a largely emotional play, as he talked again about how Chanel slighted him. And I feel like that in general, that's his biggest flaw in the game, is that he is someone that did preach a lot on honor and integrity throughout the game. And obviously by the end, that is something that ultimately cost him the game. And obviously that was on full display during the Chanel vote. At the split tribal, he does vote out Roxroy, which isn't ideal either, as obviously Roxroy was someone he had given his word to. And yes, while the numbers, again, probably weren't there anyway, again, the fact that he did give Roxroy his word only to break it immediately after isn't ideal either. But then after that, he votes out High, largely because Omar is able to convince him that High had lied to him, so that isn't ideal. At the final 7, he does get some votes against him. However, Drea becomes the boot there. And then obviously at final 6, he does go along with the split vote plan to blindside Omar. However, he was shown during a lot of that round to not be fully comfortable with it, on the chance that Lindsay played her idol on Omar, which technically Lindsay should have done, but it's not the best look for Mike either. And then from that point on, he is somewhat in a good position to where obviously at Final 5, he does win immunity there and votes out Lindsay. And at Final 4, he does get sent to fire against Jonathan. However, considering he is a firefighter, I mean, he probably had the advantage there anyway, and he does dominate Jonathan in that. And then we get the final tribal in which he definitely had a shot of winning the game. I mean, we have heard people like Roxroy, Drea even talking about wanting to vote for him coming in. Even Lindsay was someone willing to vote for him. And I feel like had he given a better final tribal performance, that he probably would have gotten more than one vote. But obviously, Marianne just completely blows him out of the water at Final Tribal, and he keeps preaching on honor and integrity, gets called out for it, doesn't really own up to his game a lot, and then through that, he ultimately loses in a 7-1 vote. So obviously, that's not ideal, but he still played a mostly impressive game. He did technically control more votes than Marianne did, but I feel like he approached the game in such a personal, emotional way while still preaching on honor and integrity that ultimately cost him at the game at the end through him like controlling certain votes in that way and then ultimately burning people at the jury to the point where he didn't get their votes at the end. So I feel like he still played an all right game. However, it's those pretty big knocks that ultimately caused him to lose it, and he's here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the player I believe played the best game on Survivor 42 is Marianne, the winner of the season. And it's sort of weird that I have Marianne this high, as I know in my Survivor 41 player ranking that I had Erica relatively low, and I talked about in my review how I feel like Marianne played a somewhat similar game to Erica for a lot of it. So obviously there was some debate over whether I had Erica too low. And I feel like in hindsight, I probably did have her too low. I probably should have given Erica more credit. And I feel like this is a way for me to articulate that a bit more. But I feel like Marianne like definitely had a rocky game, particularly in the pre-merge, to where she was considered a threat early on by people like Jackson and Mariah. And obviously at the first tribal they attend, it's basically between her and Mariah. And we literally hear like a lot of the takus talking about how Marianne is better for them short term, while Mariah is better for them long term. And obviously, like, you can question whether they made the right decision in voting out Mariah over Marianne. But obviously, she is able to be spared there, so there's that. And I feel like moving forward, I mean, yes, while she is technically in the Taku 4, I feel like she would have been in a lot of danger had she gone to any other tribals pre-merge, where obviously we saw people like Jonathan like not particularly like her too much. And I feel like in general, this sentiment that she would have been a big threat, kind of like what we saw with Elaine from IOI or Lauren Rimmer to an extent from HHH. I feel like those are all things that definitely harmed Marianne for a lot of the pre-merge, but she's obviously able to scrape on by through there. And then at the post-merge, I mean, she is technically in the Taku 4 again, and she would have been in some danger there as obviously Lydia and Romeo were on the plan to vote her out. And it seemed like with her having said the flip that she probably could have made the wrong decision there. But then Omar is able to drive the vote there, really solidify the Taku 4, and through that be able to save Marianne there over Lydia. And from that point on, she is technically in the core of the majority group with the Taku 4 running things. However, I feel like Marianne didn't have too much control within that. I feel like Omar and Lindsay had a lot more control in how the different builds are playing out. She was more so voting in the majority for the most part. And I feel like that definitely was on display during the split tribal, where Jonathan was the one to come up with a plan to blindside Drea, having Marianne as the decoy vote as part of the split vote. Despite the fact that they had a very easy split vote in Tori, they decided for whatever reason to split it on Marianne there. And she was obviously in danger as well through Drea wanting to vote her out and through wanting to idle her out of the game, potentially even use her knowledge as power to steal Marianne's idol. But then obviously we saw what happened at that split tribal where both her and Drea agreed to play their idols in order to keep themselves safe. So again, while it's not ideal that she had to play her idol there, I mean, it did show some trust and solidarity with Drea moving forward, but then she's immediately able to find another idol, which is pretty good for her end, and she is able to be in the majority for the most part moving forward. She votes out high at 8, she votes out Drea at 7, at 6, while Jonathan was the initial person to talk about voting out Omar at 6. She is the one to get the rest of them together and split the vote on Omar and Romeo. And once that comes through, along with her playing her extra vote to send Omar out in a 3-2 vote, she is able to get a lot of the credit for that, with Omar actively like going out of his way to give her credit for this move. Now I know a lot of people talk about how her extra vote mattered and how this was the first time where an extra vote truly mattered in a vote. Again, as I explained in my review, I don't think that's entirely the case, as I feel like even if she didn't use her extra vote, it would have still been a 2-2 vote. And at that point, they would have had the numbers to vote out Omar on the revote anyway. But by using her extra vote, she's able to take all the credit for the blind side. And we see that with the jury being pretty pleased by her, and with Omar being pretty satisfied by her role specifically in blindsiding him. So I feel like even then, it is still technically a good move, even though it technically wasn't the first time that the extra vote mattered in a direct sense. And then from that point on, she is kind of in a good position where at Final 5, she isn't the target there. She's able to vote out Lindsay. But to her detriment, she did consider keeping Lindsay around, which is a bit of a knock, but she ultimately makes the correct decision in voting out Lindsay. And then at 4, after Romeo wins immunity, like they have a close enough bond as underdogs, Romeo chooses to save her, sparing her from fire. And from that point on, like she had a pretty good shot of winning the game. Now, granted, Mike was her tougher beat, as we have heard since then that like people like Lindsay and Roxbury were considering voting for Mike over her at Final Tribal, but she is able to turn it up, and she has a very solid Final Tribal performance. She's able to explain her game pretty well compared to Mike, who again preached on honor and loyalty and didn't really own up to his game. She was able to articulate her game pretty well, and she obviously pulls out her idol that she never used. And that's another credit to her game, is that she was able to get Mike to play his idol on her at Final 5, which again demonstrated that she had decent social relationships in the game, and again, another display to the jury. So by her pulling out her own idol at Final Tribal, she's again able to highlight her game in a way that is able to convince the jury to vote for her. So on the whole, like, yes, while she wasn't guaranteed to win coming into Final Tribal against Mike, like she was able to successfully sway most of the votes that Mike could have gotten in her favor to where she does win in a 7-1 vote. And I feel like that is pretty impressive, all things considered. So again, if we're looking at Marianne's game as a whole, I mean, I don't think it's an overly impressive game compared to other winners. I wouldn't have her ranked super duper high on a winner ranking. And I feel like she has a lot of similarities in her game with Erica, who I did at the time of 41 rank her relatively low. However, again, I feel like my appreciation of Erica has gone up, and through me getting better at these player rankings, I feel like it's definitely given me a better sense of how to assess people within individual seasons. And I feel like this is a highlight of that, where despite me seeing Marianne's game is pretty similar to Erica's, I do have her as number 1 on this player ranking, as there are enough merits there to where even though she isn't a great winner of the game, she is definitely the best player of the season and played the best game. So for all those reasons, I have Marianne here at number 1. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video, along with my coverage of Survivor 42. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. And moving forward, I do have more general Survivor videos coming out, along with some brand seals. I know it's a bit of a slow period right now, like as we literally still have over a month before things like Big P24 and things like Survivor SA start. So stay tuned for general Survivor videos in the future. But for now, that is the video. See ya.